Africa is once again the center of global attention. From Washington to Beijing and Moscow, every major power wants a seat at the African table. But this time, the story isn't about colonial conquest. It's about influence, investment, and ideology. This is the new scramble for Africa, and the United States is racing to redefine its foreign policy before it loses the continent to its rivals. For decades, Africa was a secondary concern in U.S. foreign policy, overshadowed by wars in the Middle East, NATO commitments, and Asia's economic rise. But today, Africa is home to 1.4 billion people, the world's youngest population, and a projected $3 trillion market under the AfCFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Area. With 60% of the population under 25, Africa represents not just a consumer base, but the workforce, creativity, and markets that will shape global growth over the next 50 years. For Washington, that means one thing: Africa can no longer be ignored. The U.S. relationship with Africa has always been shaped by the politics of its time. In the 1960s, Washington backed newly independent nations through programs like the Peace Corps and USAID, promoting democracy and development, but always through a Cold War lens. Any country leaning towards socialism risked being labeled pro-Soviet. During the 1990s, under Presidents Clinton and Bush, U.S. policy shifted toward trade and health diplomacy, launching initiatives like PEPFAR, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, and support for regional peacekeeping. But critics argue that much of this engagement was reactive and humanitarian, not strategic, leaving room for others to step in. Enter the new power players. Over the last 20 years, China has poured more than $155 billion into African infrastructure. Railways, ports, highways, and industrial parks, under its Belt and Road Initiative. From the Mombasa-Nairobi Railway to the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa, Beijing's footprint is everywhere. Meanwhile, Russia is re-emerging on the continent, not with cash, but with guns and influence. Through the Wagner Group and arms deals, Moscow has gained footholds in Mali, Central African Republic, Sudan, and more, offering military aid and political support in exchange for mining concessions and loyalty at the UN. By 2023, African nations were voting more frequently with China and Russia than with the US on key UN resolutions. For Washington, that set off alarm bells. In late 2022, the Biden administration launched its U.S. strategy towards sub-Saharan Africa, promising a 21st century partnership built on mutual respect and shared prosperity. It pledged $55 billion over 3 years for trade, health, climate, and security, a move seen as Washington's answer to China's growing dominance.
The United States is all in on Africa's future.
The policy marked a shift from viewing Africa merely as a recipient of aid to seeing it as an equal partner in shaping the global order. High-profile visits followed: Kamala Harris in Ghana, Blinken in Nigeria, Yellen in Senegal, each signaling renewed American interest. But beyond handshakes and photo ops, analysts asked, is this rhetoric or real re-engagement? The 2022 U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit hosted 49 African heads of state, the first in 8 years. It produced key commitments: support for AfCFTA implementation and regional trade corridors, partnerships in clean energy and digital transformation, re-entry of the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, DFC, to back African startups. At the same time, the U.S. opened new embassies in Niger and Madagascar, reactivated the Prosper Africa Trade Program, and sought to align private sector investment with political outreach. Yet critics argue that Washington still relies too heavily on summits and speeches, while China and Russia are signing contracts and building roads. For much of the 2000s, U.S.-Africa relations were defined by aid, not investment. Programs like PEPFAR saved 25 million lives from HIV/AIDS. USAID invested billions in agriculture and education. But today, that model is being questioned. Younger Africans are asking, why aid when we want trade? Why charity when we want partnership? In response, Washington is pivoting, tying aid to digital infrastructure, renewable energy, and entrepreneurship. Initiatives like Power Africa and Feed the Future now include private sector financing and AFCFTA alignment, aiming to link U.S. businesses directly to African markets. The U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, DFC, is key here, mobilizing $60 billion in loans and guarantees to catalyze African-led ventures. In the great power competition of the 21st century, Africa is no longer peripheral. It's the swing region. With 54 votes at the United Nations and growing economic leverage, Africa can determine outcomes on climate policy, trade reform, and geopolitical alignments. That's why Washington is competing so hard, not just for contracts, but for influence. The U.S. now views Africa as central to its global strategy. From supply chain resilience to critical minerals for EV batteries. But as global powers jostle for control, Africa itself is rewriting the rules. From the African Union's seat at the G20 to the AFCFTA creating a single continental market, African leaders are demanding agency, not allegiance. They want trade deals that build capacity, not debt. Partnerships that transfer technology, not dependency. For the U.S., success in Africa will depend on whether it can listen, not lecture, and invest in Africa's priorities, not its own fears of rivals. Africa doesn't want to choose between Washington, Beijing, or Moscow. It wants to choose itself and the partners that treat it with respect. In this new era of diplomacy, the question is simple. Will the United States finally see Africa not as a battlefield for influence, but as a partner in shaping the world's future?